Welcome to the Promotion Man podcast video version. For some of you, you know that there's a Promotion Man podcast available everywhere where you get your podcast, but it's audio. We wanted to graduate to the video piece of this show, and so today is our first episode of that. This is my partner, Michael Kaufman.
Hello there.
And we're going to take you on a behind-the-scenes stories behind the music of some of the best, most iconic classic rock bands that we know and love.
This is going to be a fun trip, Fred.
It is going to be a fun trip, and hopefully you'll enjoy all of it because as we keep going with the show, we'll interview rock stars, we'll interview concert promoters, rock and roll photographers, band managers, so you'll understand what it was like for somebody to manage a band. And then we'll continue to go on. But one of the things that I want to tell you is when I joined Warner Brothers in 1978, these are just some of the bands I worked with just that year alone. I worked with Montrose, Van Halen, the Funkadelics, Black Sabbath, Gordon Lightfoot, Robert Palmer, Chaka Khan, Leon Russell, the Ramones, Al Jarreau, Michael Franks, Little Feat, Bob Marley and the Wailers, Steve Martin, Seals and Crofts, the Doobie Brothers, Neil Young, George Benson, Thin Lizzy, Bonnie Raitt, Foghat, Talking Heads, and many, many more. So we'll cover a lot of those, and what we're going to do, at least in the beginning, is we're going to kind of follow my tour schedule of 1978. And that tour schedule, as crazy as it sounds, and I have to look at my notes, is I had 36 different recording artists that played 47 different concerts.
Wow.
I know.
That's pretty amazing.
And I mean, for example, Van Halen, they had 4 dates with me that year.
Right.
I think the Talking Heads had 4 dates.
Right.
So, and then some were one-offs, but that's kind of what we'll do.
All right. That sounds great. So I'm Big Michael Kaufman, and I've been in radio for decades and decades like Fred, and I worked with a lot of people like Fred over the years, so I'm really excited to be here because now I get to kind of ask some questions that I've always wanted to ask, and you're the man with the answers.
Yeah, and it'll be a lot of fun.
So I think the way to start, Fred, is really because I'd like to know all the ins and outs of being a promotion man because they'll see the logo and say promotion man. What is that? How does that come about?
They were responsible for getting the music on the radio was the number one thing. And every record label, whether it was Warner Brothers, Capitol, RCA, Columbia, they all had their own staff. And back then, it was radio. That's where you were going to get new music. And then, of course, you had Rolling Stone magazine and Cream magazine and other magazines. Right. But it was promotion people, so there was both men and women.
Okay.
And they were almost always just music junkies, basically. People that just absolutely loved music and had the ability to sell. Because as you might think, it might be easy to say, well, how hard was it to get Van Halen on the radio or Black Sabbath on the radio? Truth be told, there's only so many slots for new music on radio.
Right.
And every record label, whether it's Columbia or Epic or RCA or A&M or Warner Brothers, they're all fighting for those slots. And we're going to get into that. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the politics. We're going to talk about touring bands, how I use touring bands to leverage getting a brand new band like, let's say, the Pretenders, a shot on radio when, you know, radio may not have wanted to play them. And that's the things that we'll get into, and I think you might find a lot of these stories very fascinating.
It's pretty cool, Fred. So look, how does a kid in Detroit, I mean, that's Motor City. I mean, you got GM, Ford, you know.
Yeah, so I grew up in Detroit, and my major goal was to stay out of the car factories.
All right.
And I had gotten introduced to a buddy whose dad owned a record store.
Okay.
And that one record store became 38 record stores across the state of Michigan.
Oh, wow.
So he would get all these really great tickets to concerts. But believe it or not, there were publicity tours where like Aerosmith would come and the promotion man would rent a private hall and they'd have ice carvings and shrimp and hors d'oeuvres and open bar. And the band would literally walk around and shake hands. They weren't playing.
Right.
But their album would be on the speakers in the room, And that's what fascinated me. And I'm like, well, who's that guy? What does he do? And I realized that record label inside the center there was a company. And they function as a company, and they have a bunch of different roles, from publicity to the A&R person that finds the band and signs them, to the in-house engineers that record and produce the records, the marketing department, the publicity department, promotion, sales, all of that.
Yeah, because a lot of people think, and I did until you and I were talking the other day, sales and promotion are two really different areas for the record label.
It's exactly right. So let's do this. What I'd like to do now is tell you all what my first day at Warner Brothers was like. Because here's a record company that I interviewed with all of them, quite frankly. And I was very young, and I was inexperienced, and, they just didn't take a chance on me. And Warner Brothers, I interviewed 5 times. I don't know who does that,
Wow.
but I did. And they finally came to my restaurant, because during the day I would work in a record warehouse, because the bottom line is, whatever your goals are in life, if you want to be a chef, for example, you got to get in the kitchen. If you want to get into video production, you've got to be an intern and have a starting point. So for me, I would work in these really amazing Detroit restaurants at night, and I'd bank really great money. And then I'd get up early and go work in record warehouse, where I would be loading boxes, cardboard boxes of albums, into trucks that would be distributed around the country.
Wow.
And I remember, loading up Stevie Wonder, Songs in the Key of Life, and all these ALO and all these amazing bands that would, when we'd have skids of cardboard boxes filled with records. So at night, I would work at this restaurant. So I put that on my application with Warner Brothers on the 5th time. And I interviewed with them earlier in the day. And then I went to my restaurant. And this was a restaurant that had like Lee Iacocca, who was a head of Chrysler, but he actually was the guy that designed the Mustang.
Yeah.
All the automotive titans would come to this restaurant, and it was exclusive. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, I look in one of my corner booths, and I've got all the guys that I interviewed with earlier.
Oh, wow.
And of course, I go to them, and they have an amazing expense account, which I learned to really love myself. And they were ordering all this expensive wine. And then I said to them, I said, so what brings you out to this restaurant? And they said, well, you've been a pain in our ass for years, and we just decided to finally hire you.
Wow.
So they hired me, and honestly, man, it was just the most incredible feeling, because I had tried so hard. I think it took me 4 years.
Yeah.
So that following Monday was my very first day on the job, and before I started, I devoured Billboard magazine. That's something we're going to talk about as well. How does a record become a #1 record? What is that? How is that determined? When people say, "Well, I've got the #1 song in America," so we're going to talk about that. But Billboard was primarily one of several music trade magazines that gauge both sales and airplay. So what I wanted to do was completely indoctrinate myself on where were the Warner Brother bands, what songs were on the charts, where were they, and then I started that Monday.
Wow.
Well, there was a guy who was he was training me, not interviewing me, and his father owned Fruit of the Loom distribution, underpants, T-shirts, socks. And so when we were together, I had said to him, I said, why would you leave Warner Brothers? And he goes, well, I don't think there's a future there, so I'm going to go work with my dad. So he might be, the king of that company at this point. But what we were told at Burbank that Monday morning was to pack our bags. We're going to go out all week. And what I need to tell the audience is that there were 23 Warner Brother reps spread out across the country. So what that meant was we had somebody in Seattle, Chicago, Atlanta, New York, Detroit, Miami, Denver, and we were like an army. In the promotion staff, if you look at it like war, the big commanders were basically the presidents of the company, and they were in Burbank, California, for Warner Brothers, and they would operate at a high level. But us promotion people were kind of like foot soldiers. We were the ones in the front line, and the front line was radio, a guy like you.
Absolutely.
And I would come to you on your days that you would see record people, and in the lobby would be the other record reps, and we'd all have our new records to promote to you. And there was only going to be 2 or 3 that are lucky enough to get added to that playlist for that week. Well, we were told to pack our bags and go to every single rock and roll radio station, and then they emergency shipped us this red vinyl disc that they call an EP. It had 5 songs from the album, and it had the Looney Tunes logo on one side because we're Bugs Bunny, and then it had the original Van Halen logo on the other side. Yeah, it was the original where it just said Van Halen versus the V and the H. And that's who we were blitzing. We were blitzing a brand new debut album by a band called Van Halen.
Wow.
And blitzing was that all 23 people throughout the country were going to those rock and roll radio stations with these red vinyl discs. And that's something I have to tell you. I'm so happy to have this job. Mike Diamond, the guy who's training me, he's wearing his Warner Brothers Bugs Bunny jacket, which is a varsity jacket with Bugs Bunny popping out of the Warner Brother logo with an album. And we're on our way to Toledo, Ohio, and we get into the radio station, and we literally hang with the guy who's on the air, just like we're talking in the mics. And on the other side of that mic are all these listeners. Yeah. They might be in their cars, they might be in their office, homes, who knows? But they're all listening to that radio station, and he pops down that red disc, and it starts spinning, and he puts on Running with the Devil, which has that incredible intro. It was wild. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up because you realize the power of radio at that moment in time.
Yeah, that's awesome. So let me ask you this. Do you still have one of those red?
I do.
That's awesome.
And they're definitely a collector's item for sure.
Absolutely. Okay, so before you get into some of the nuts and bolts about dealing, with promotion on a band like Van Halen, what were those guys like? Now, a lot of us have met them in a meet and greet situation or whatever, but then that's a show. So you worked with them, you were around them like business stuff. So how are they in a business setting?
Well, that's a great question. Well, so first of all, that was that Monday. So from Monday to Wednesday, we went to every rock station, and everybody started playing the Van Halen in a very hot rotation. And back then in album rock, they would play album tracks. So they would play 4 or 5 songs off the album, not just one. So we had to get back to Detroit on that Thursday, March 10th. And that was because Van Halen was put on a tour with Journey, which had just hired Steve Perry to be their lead singer. And then there was a guy named Ronnie Montrose where Sammy Hagar had his start.
Absolutely.
And the band was called Montrose, and they were a Warner Brother act as well. Well, Ronnie's tour was just finishing up. Journey was just taking off with their brand new tour, and we were able to put Van Halen in the front. So that Thursday, March 10th, they played Masonic Temple in Detroit.
Wow.
And so prior to the show, Mike Diamond, the guy training me, went and got them from the hotel, brought them to the WIA office. And this is another thing we're going to talk about. How are records distributed? They can cut an album, but how does it get from the factory pressing to the record stores? And then, of course, you might have heard of promo copies or DJ copies, which weren't for sale. Those were the product we gave to the DJs and the record stores to play. And so WIA stands for Warner, Elektra, and Atlantic.
Okay.
And all 3 of those are separate labels, but they were owned by the Warner Communication Company. And so all of their albums, or music actually, was distributed throughout the country by WIA. So Mike brings the band into WIA, and it's David Lee Roth, Michael Anthony, Alex Van Halen, and Eddie Van Halen. And they realized that they could walk away with armfuls of DJ copies of AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stones, whatever WIA, those labels had.
Brought, yeah.
So they came rolling in, and in this particular office, we had a meeting table. And just like here, we had a turntable with all the new product, because when we sat at that meeting table for our Monday morning meetings, promotion people would be introducing the new music to the sales staff
Okay.
and the different people that worked for WIA. So Eddie goes straight to the turntable, finds the brand new AC/DC album, and cranks it. I mean, just cranks
Wow.
it. And the guy who was the manager of that WIA branch, his name was Gil Roberts, he always sucked on a cigar. He wouldn't light it and smoke it in the room, in the building.
Typical record.
And he was an
label.
Italian dude. And he damn near choked on that cigar when he came out. And he goes, "What the hell's going on?" And then I said, "Gil, I want to introduce you to Van Halen." And of course, he stopped and went, "Oh, hey," and said hello to everybody, because Warner's put a pretty heavy push on this band. We felt like they were going to be something. And at that moment in time, quite frankly, disco was just waning. Punk rock just started coming onto the scene, and we had the Ramones and the Talking Heads and Madness and quite a few Dead Boys. We had quite a few bands through the Sire label. Mm-hmm. All things we're going to talk about more in depth as this podcast continues. But we took them to WIA. They all left with armfuls of DJ copies of albums. Sound check for almost every band is usually between 4 and 5 o'clock. So by 4 o'clock, we were at the theater watching them sound check. And what was crazy, Michael, was that Eddie had this bomb, basically, standing on the fins, vertical. And he cut out the center and had his guitar gear in there. And Eddie always stood left of stage if you're facing the crowd. Michael was right of stage, and David Lee Roth is in the center.
Okay.
And very soon after, because I had them several times that year, that bomb came off. And the reason for it was, A, it didn't belong there, but this was their very first tour. They didn't really know what they were doing.
Yeah.
And they were actually really rough that day. The very first show I saw, which was their third show as a signed band, they played Madison, Wisconsin,
Okay.
Chicago, Illinois, and then Detroit. But they were rough, but it was still pretty thrilling.
Yeah.
I didn't really know much about the band until I hired to Warner Brothers, because they were that new.
Right.
Then after the show, of course, you go back and you spend time with them. And so to get back to your question, what was it like for them to be in a business mode? Dude, it was a world party. It was a worldwide party.
Yeah.
Because we were all 22, 21, 23. They were new to Warner Brothers. I was new to Warner Brothers. We literally started at the very same time. And they were extremely serious about their music. But this is in an era where there was illicit drugs that were all over the place.
Shocking.
There were these beautiful girls that like to hang out with rock stars. Another shocking thing about that. We traveled by limo pretty much everywhere we went. So limousines were part of our world. And they were notorious for ransacking hotel rooms.
Oh, yeah.
It's the rock and roll thing to do.
Lifestyle, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So they were my first entry into the music business, and wow, it was a rock and roll ride of a lifetime, because I was with them for the next 5 years.
That's incredible. So what about some of these other bands? You said in that first year you had a bunch of bands that were out there. I know you said with Van Halen they went on, I think they crossed over on that Montrose tour a little bit at one point, and then were out there with Journey. Is that correct?
Yeah, so here's what happened. We were able to put them on the tour, and Journey was working with Columbia Records, or CBS, and they enjoyed having Van Halen, in the intro in the beginning, because soon the band, before the year was out, they were headlining. Mm-hmm. That's how fast they took off. And technically, when you sign a band, we always usually signed a band for a 2-album deal. And rarely did we do more. We did more when we signed Prince, which was actually at this exact same time too. So this is March. In April, I get a brand new Prince single, the very first debut single of Prince. And at that time, he's 18. He wrote, arranged, produced, played all the instruments.
That's incredible.
And what I can tell you is we were in a bidding war with Epic Records. And Prince is a very interesting guy, because clearly he's a genius. When you are 18 and you wrote, arranged, produced, wrote the songs, played all the instruments. He was hell-bent on being his own engineer. And Epic was pushing back. They only wanted to give him a 2-album deal, and they wanted to sign him an engineer. And Warner Brothers said, look, we'll do a 3-album deal, and we'll let you, be your executive producer. And quite frankly, we didn't really make money as a record company on those first 3 albums.
Really?
Yeah. And he was so prolific in the studio. But Burbank, when they were getting the bills, the invoices, they went, this is crazy. So they went and bought him all his equipment so that it was more cost effective for us to let Prince do his own thing.
That's
But
crazy.
that came out so I'm with Van Halen in March. I'm with, and I've got these songs to work. So I worked the Prince song in April. I was out on the road with Black Sabbath, who we eventually put Van Halen on that tour.
There's all those stories about how Van Halen just blew Black Sabbath away on stage.
They actually did, and here's what happened. The first show, I said it was rough. It was, because they weren't used to playing on such a big stage. They were playing the Whiskey in L.A. on Sunset. They were playing different venues that were nothing like a huge stage. And when you get into a huge production, there's a lot of real estate on that stage. There's a lot of gear on that stage, and they had to find their way. But it really didn't take them long. So when we put them on the Black Sabbath tour, it was just them and Black Sabbath, and we kind of controlled it because they were both Warner Brother acts. They eventually did blow them away, but Ozzy had so many problems with alcohol and drugs, and the band was just frustrated with his antics, and that's when Van Halen really started to come on. But I had Gordon Lightfoot on the road for a couple dates. We had Robert Palmer, who, was just a wonderful guy to work with. He was probably one of the most best-dressed lead singers. Always shirt and tie,
yeah, he's kind of famous for that.
Super classy. And he was a lot of fun. And he was signed to Island Records. So what I should do is tell the audience that Warner Brothers was a very smart company. They were very artist-driven. We weren't as much into hit singles like a lot of other record companies. We were into careers, and we wanted to build careers, which is why we were 3 albums deep with Prince, and we didn't drop him.
Wow.
And he was a negative on our cash flow. But we stuck with him because we felt like there was something there, and clearly it paid off. So they also would look at these smaller little boutique labels, like Sire Records that had the Ramones, the Talking Heads. We ended up signing a girl named Madonna that brought a lot of money into the company. Island Records we partnered with, who at the time had Robert Palmer. They had Bob Marley and the Wailers. They had Steve Winwood. And so we would distribute and promote them. Bearsville had Foghat and Todd Rundgren, so I worked with them.
You talk about all these labels, man. Growing up as a kid, I remember seeing all of those, because back in those days, you
yeah,
looked
they all
at them.
have like their own
Little
logos.
logos.
There's Island, there's Sire, there's Warner Brothers.
I remember Casablanca was really cool because it had the camel and all the castle and things. So.
Yeah, and what was funny about Casablanca, they made a ton of money on the disco era.
Yeah, exactly.
But they originally signed Kiss.
That was their first band.
Yeah.
And then I think Donna Summer or something
yes,
right after that.
Yes,
so very strange combination.
The rest of my year was amazing. I mean, because we had Chaka Khan. Our R&B department was amazing. We had the Funkadelics. We had Chaka Khan. Prince obviously was in the R&B as well as pop. We had George Benson.
Wow.
We just had some Ashford Simpson. We just had some pretty amazing R&B music. And then, of course, Sire Records was very hip to this punk movement. And the punk movement was simply a stripped-down version of rock. Mm-hmm. It was way more in your face. And it's funny how difficult it was for a promotion man like me to get the Ramones airplay.
I bet.
Because radio is like,
nobody's playing.
We're not going to touch that.
Yeah.
And yet today, if you listen to some of the Ramones tracks, they're very poppy.
Absolutely.
And it's, and it's crazy, and
just too progressive for the time.
And there's a gold record for Ramones over here in the corner. That took 30 years to get to a gold.
Wow.
And just for the viewers, gold is 500,000, platinum is 1 million. And then they don't have like 5 million, but they do have what's called diamond. And diamond is when it goes to 10 million. So the debut album of Van Halen, which is down here behind me in the corner, went diamond. And so that's how they gauged units sold. On my tour list that first year, I also had we had some great jazz bands. Al Jarreau, Michael Franks had a hit called Popsicle Toes. There was this amazing guy named Pat Metheny. He's still recording today. And he is this guitar virtuoso. And he looks like a rocker. He had really long hair like I did at the time. And if you see him, you just assume he's in a rock band. But when you see him play, they're so intricate and they're so delicate and they go into these crescendos where it's very soft and easy, and then it just builds into this amazing thing. And he's very well known in the jazz world. And I remember being in a sound check with him, and I'm the only guy sitting in the auditorium. I pick like row 8 and sit there and watch him. Because my job is to take them to radio, and if we do an in-store where they do autograph signings, those are all part of my responsibility. So with Al Jarreau, I would try to have interviews with jazz magazines or newspaper music critics, because we want to expand their base any way we can. Okay. And if it can't be radio, then we go to press. Right. So if somebody reads an article and goes, gosh, this guy sounds interesting, he may go buy the record. So I'm watching Pat Metheny and his band do sound check. And then he looks at me and he gets into this rock and roll riff, and it was like really dirty.
Oh, that's wild.
It was great.
The jazz guy.
And then he looks at me kind of like, I can do that rock and roll too.
No sweat.
We had Bob Marley and the Wailers. We had Little Feat, and I'd like to do a kind of a shout out today because today is Lowell George's birthday.
Okay.
And Little Feat was a band that Warner Brothers adopted and put our arms around as what we would call our house band. Because at Warner Brothers, obviously we had the superstars like Fleetwood Mac and Doobie Brothers and Dire Straits and Prince and Van Halen and all these big bands. But Little Feat, everybody loved them, from the mailroom guy down to the chairman of the board, Mo Austin. Everybody loved Little Feat. And so the year that I got to work with them, May 24th and 25th in Detroit, June 4th in Detroit, they had released an album called Waiting on Columbus. Okay. And it was a live album. And we at Warner Brothers all celebrated, because when you saw this band live, any musician understands that there are times when you just make magic. I mean, it's magical. And when you can put that down on a recording and it's picked up as that amazing recording, then the listeners can feel that. Absolutely. And Waiting on Columbus is still a double album that I listen to on a regular basis because it's just so great. So I'm with Warner Brothers in March. So in March, April, May, 3 months later, I'm with Bob Marley and the Wailers.
Wow.
I mean, I shook his hand.
That is incredible, man.
And I got to be honest, we didn't know Bob Marley was going to be like this iconic global superstar. Yep. I mean, if you travel at all, anywhere, Europe, Asia, anywhere, Caribbean, you'll see a Bob Marley T-shirt and you see Ramon T-shirt. Yeah. I think there's more Ramon T-shirts than the 500,000 units.
They sold more T-shirts than albums?
Yeah. So we didn't know back then that they would become as legendary as they became. So it was an absolute amazing pleasure to be with them. But as I continue on my tour, I've got Marshall Tucker Band, the Climax Blues Band, Seals and Crofts. Remember Steve Martin?
Oh, absolutely.
King Tut?
Yeah. Did he have his banjo?
Yes. And at the time he had the arrow and a chicken.
Exactly.
And
so when you have one hit and it's a comedy song, how do you fill the rest of the 90-minute set?
That's funny you should say that, because if we dig down to the very beginning of Warner Brother Records, Warner's got into the record label business late. They got in the business in 1958. Okay. Well, Elvis was already happening. Uh-huh. And Elvis really turned the switches to the cash flow of what a hit record could do. Uh-huh. So the very first album that Warner Brothers put out was a Bob Newhart. He was a very famous comic. Stand-up comic, and we sold like 6 or 800,000 units.
Wow.
You know, and the first rock band Warner Brothers signed was the Grateful Dead.
Wow.
Because their first signings were Peter, Paul, and Mary, which were very folk, you know, and Petula Clark, who was just this like songbird, you know. And then all of a sudden they signed the Grateful Dead. And some of these signings really were to position the company to other musicians to take notice and go, wow, if they sign the Grateful Dead, maybe that's the record company I want to be with. And I found that in the world of politics to be a very big deal. Some of the bands that I was with on their tour bus, and we would talk, you know, intimately, they would say, man, we always wanted to be with Warner Brothers. And I think you could look at every record label and say that each one of them had their own kind of groove. If you look at Atlantic Records, which is a phenomenal label, they had Led Zeppelin. They had one time had the Rolling Stones. They have Bad Company and Foreigner and AC/DC, and you know, and so when
And he had Asylum, who had all that whole California folk.
So Asylum, yes. So Electra Asylum had the Joni Mitchell, the Jackson Brown, the Eagles, the Joni Mitchell, the Linda Ronstadts. Yeah. So when you look at that, you can actually see that they have their own identification of music, if you will.
Yeah, because everybody wonders how these hits come about. I mean, how does a record actually? I mean, some of us know how they land at the radio station, but what happens before?
Exactly. And so what I want to do is kind of take it to demo tapes, to signing a deal, discovering a band in a club, producing the record, you know, and those are all fascinating stories that I'd like to have on the show. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun.
Oh, I thought the information was great.
Good.
I appreciate it, Fred.
Do you have any more questions?
Oh, I have a lot of questions.
But we're going to save that for episode 2.
That's it.
Okay, great. Well, it was great. Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show, and thank you.